Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Billy Wilder Theater, home of the public programs for the UCLA Film and Television Archive. My name is Paul Malcolm. I'm a programmer at the archive. Thank you for coming out to the second night in our program, Enlightening Vision, recent films by Nathaniel Dorsky and Jerome Hiler. Last night we presented four works by Jerome Hilar, and tonight we're presenting a mix of films, two films by Jerome Hilar and two films by Nathaniel Dorsky. It's been, I think, 8 years since Nathaniel Dorsky was here at the Wilder, and this is the first time we've shown Jerome's work here, and I have to say again, it's just an incredible honor and pleasure to have them here with us in person. So let's just welcome them to the theater right now. So I've got a couple people to thank. First of all, just Nathaniel and Jerome for coming down and for curating the program and putting it together. So thank you very much for that. I also want to thank Los Angeles Film Forum for their support of this entire series. So if you're not a member of Film Forum, we show these kinds of works, independent experimental works, whenever we can, but Film Forum does it year-round all the time, so become a member if you're not. And I also want to give a very special thank you to the person who put all of this together, organized it, communicated with everybody, and made it happen, Steve Anker. Thank you, Steve. It's always a real joy to work with Steve. So just a few quick program notes. So tonight, like I said, we're going to be presenting two works by Jerome Hilar, Facades and Bagatelle 1. And then Nathaniel will come up and introduce his two works after that, Autumn and Colophon. And then we'll have a Q&A with Jerome and Nathaniel and Steve on stage afterwards. So please stick around for that. There's going to be sort of like we're going to try and get about like a break between each one of the films. So the screen will be black, the theater will be dark, so you can sort of contemplate what you've seen in between the films. So don't worry, the breaks are supposed to be there. And then tomorrow night on Sunday at 7 p.m., we're going to be presenting Nathaniel Dorsky's Arboretum Cycle. So please come back for that. That's going to be a very special program as well. This whole weekend, last night's films were just so beautiful and inspiring. So it's really great to see everybody here, and I hope you come back tomorrow night as well. So without any further ado, please help me welcome to the stage. Am I supposed to? Oh, are we showing the extra film? I guess we're showing. It's been decided that after the Q&A, we'll be showing the latest world premiere of Nathaniel's latest work after the film. So I was going to ask you as I walked up, but that's fantastic. So please stay for that. So without any further ado, please help me welcome to the stage Steve Anker.
Before I say anything else, I want you to know that print arrived from the lab this morning. And we just saw it for the first time a couple hours ago. And so we're all in for a treat, an extra treat. I want to thank Paul. Paul has been not only open and interested in this, but it's been over a period of a couple of years because we've been talking about bringing Nathaniel and Jerome down for that long. And this was the place to do it. It is the best place, the best place in the LA area that can show films at the speed needed to show the films by both Jerome and Nathaniel. And of course, it's a great theater, so it's terrific that you, KJ, your whole team is behind independent and I guess we call experimental film. It's an important treasure for us to be able to have access to this theater. So I just want to say a few things, and we'll get underway. So this is, as I was thinking about it, and really this is an evening about love affairs, you might say, among many other ways of thinking about the night. But here are two filmmakers who've shared their lives for over 50 years. Clearly impacted, influenced each other while being able to go on in their own individual ways at the same time. And each has stayed true to their passion for 16 millimeter film. And that is going back over 50 years as well, to the early 1960s at least. And also the great tool, for independent filmmaking that came really into its own in the 60s, the Bolex camera. And both Nathaniel and Jerome, to my mind, are masters of what you could think of as an instrument, as much of an instrument as any musical instrument, well, any other device, through which expression can be created. So this is, on one level, a simple tool, especially by comparison with what the technologies we have today. And yet, the degree to which each, has made it their own. Well, for one thing, I think it also says something about this medium, which is at the moment kind of at the most a background of the culture. But it's also a love affair about the arts, because both of them, each of them, in addition to being filmmakers their whole lives and being wrapped up in the art of cinema in its fullest range, really, they're just passionate and deeply involved in music, poetry, painting, dance, pretty much all the arts I can think of, and it informs their lives, but it absolutely informs their own art. And I'd say it's actually evident. It's clear to me, even though they're working not only in 16 millimeter, but at a slow rate, that is to say, the slow projection rate of 18 frames, which, as Jerome said the other day, goes back to the earliest time of cinema. So in a way, it's also harking back to the beginnings, in a sense, even though it's completely contemporary the way that each of them works. But the fact is that they're also working in silence. And so regardless of all that, the fact is that I think that they bring an entire world to the world of visual expression. So each of them has been at the center of what we call experimental film going back to the early 60s, actually, I say, more than 50 years. And, pretty much the New York scene, the underground film scene, each was involved with filmmakers of the time as young men. I mean, in terms of studying their work and really being part of that exciting time. Gregory Markopoulos, Stan Brakhage, Andy Warhol. And they were working certainly going back that far, but each kind of went, let's just say, into themselves in terms of their own work, especially through the 70s and into the early 80s, and not showing work publicly, not maybe even finishing work at that point. But in 1982 is when Nathaniel released Hours for Jerome, which is a wonderful, lengthy film, which is, you could talk about it in many ways, but among other things, it kind of sets the stage for his later work, celebrating light and dailiness and a portrait of people close to him, especially Jerome. And in the years since then, he's made many films, and in 1996, I think, he released Trieste, which was the first of a series of more than 20 films utilizing his way of compressed and what he calls polyvalent montage, this rich form of braiding together shots. So he's been working nonstop, we might say, I'd say, since then, and releasing work. And by the way, we're very lucky to have him with us, because it wasn't that long ago that he had a serious operation, but we weren't sure he was going to make it, but it's great to have Nathaniel with us tonight. Jerome had been showing work for many years privately, mostly to friends, and then in the 1990s began to show more publicly, and in those years since then has completed a handful of films, each one, to my mind, just a little miracle of seeing and what 16 millimeter is capable of doing. We saw this incredible program last night, and if you weren't here, just say look forward to the time when you'll have a chance to see these films. And so each of their films, in ways are very related but yet distinct. I mean, for one thing, Nathaniel's work is pretty much all in camera, the way that he photographs, and with fantastic senses of depth and complexity, but as he sees and as the camera is able to record. And then, of course, as I say, through this marvelous form of montage. Jerome has a much more direct hands-on approach, perhaps, where Sometimes he'll run a single piece of film through the camera many times for many layerings. And then he actually will physically, as we saw last night as well, sometimes interact with the material, scratch on it in different ways, deal with it so that its chemistry comes forth as part of the expression. But each of them is really interested, I think, in searching for the sublime, and in ways in which our seeing can really open up worlds within each of us, awaken us in a sense, but actually, through our eyes, actually touch our entire beings. Something you can say about any great artist and any great filmmaker, but I think each of them does it very much in their own ways. I also want to say that in the years since both of them have been finishing work and showing, they've been showing them increasingly around the world, especially in New York City, where for many years each of them would show, when they were finishing something, usually a film in the Views from the Avant-Garde series as part of the annual New York Film Festival. And that, let's see, might culminated in a full retrospective for both of them, of their complete films, in, I think, was it 2015 rather. And I want to mention that the primary, I think, inspiration for those screenings was Mark McElhatton, who's with us here tonight. We're very happy to have Mark with us. So I'm not going to go on much longer, but I will say that we are going to see, as Paul said, several new films. And every time I see a new film by either Jerome or Nathaniel, I'm just amazed that they can take their distinctive way of seeing and deepen it, enrich it in ways that, I continue to make discoveries about what I can see in the visible world, but things that I would never normally ever be able to see before. So I want to introduce Jerome and just say a couple more words about him. And one is that, as I said, he, along with Nathaniel Nick, is involved in all the arts and is part of his life. And this is a man whose humility belies the fact that he's got one of the deepest sensibilities of anyone I've ever known, I can honestly say, and for whom I think everything intermingles in a way that he's able to bring into a new form of expression with a freshness that is just very down to earth, but very genuine and deeply feeling. Jerome also works with stained glass, and I'd say he's become, I'm sure, something of a scholar of medieval stained glass, but he's also worked in that form as well as other forms of art as well. Anyway, so we're very lucky to have with us Jerome Hilar, and we're going to see two brand new pieces that I don't think have ever been projected before. So, Jerome Hilar.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Paul. And thank you, Mark McElhatton. I'm glad you mentioned Mark. I was going to mention Mark as well. It continues to be wonderful to be here in Los Angeles. I wish I were here longer, and I wish I were here more. Certainly seeing my films projected last night in such a beautiful theater with a beautiful projection system. You're very lucky to have this here. And I wish there were more places like this. The two films I'm showing tonight are in somewhat of a fragile state. The first film is called Facades, and it is it's on its way to almost being complete, I would say. It's in formation enough, but it's a work print tape spliced, and I certainly hope we'll have no trouble showing it. It's in my only film and shot in color negative, which for me as a person, I regard myself as a colorist, and it's been a challenge, this sort of stock. It seems to have only three colors, orange, green, and blue. That's about it. And so it's been difficult to work with. But the film Facades is some kind of to me, a rhapsody about California. And that's about all I would say about that. Then comes a shorter film, an even more precarious state, because this film is a reversal film. That is to say, it's the original film, tape spliced, and you may see jumps a bit as it goes through the projector. Some of the jumping, I imagine there might be times when the jumping is intentional, and then there will be times when jumping is not intentional. But in any case, I couldn't resist showing them. Bagatelle 1 is the second one, and that is a kind of a portrait of a young painter, a friend of mine who I also feature in Marginalia last night. So that's it. Facades, the California one. Facades has some scratches on it, but that's the work print. Don't worry about that. And the second one will be Bagatelle 1. Bagatelle 1 did show one time, some years ago, in the New York Film Festival, actually.
Not in this form.
Not in this form. It's been highly amended. Okay.
Again, thank you all for coming to the show and being able to share in this such an excellent facility. Makes so much sense here, this kind of film. I'm going to show, tomorrow night, I'm showing, for me, a grand work, which is 2 hours and 17 minutes. 12 months in the garden in Golden Gate Park in San Francisco. But I think it's a little more than that. And around that large work, there's 4 other films, 2 that precede it and 2 that follow it. And tonight I'm going to show first one that preceded it, a film called Autumn, which is about 26 minutes, and it's about exactly this time of year. It's about not the glories of autumn, but more the darkenings of the days, the lengthening of the nights, that whole period of time of going into the depths of the winter solstice. And this is a year that was preceded by maybe 4 to 5 years of drought, as you know if you've lived here that long. And that autumn, it began to rain for the first time in 4 or 5 years. I mean, really rain in a gorgeous way. So the film is about that, in a sense, just that period of time. That film was followed by a film I'm not going to show tonight called The Dreamer, and then that led to the Arboretum cycle. Following the Arboretum cycle, I made a film called Colophon for the Arboretum cycle. A colophon, some of you may know in a Western context, is a little paragraph at the end of a book which might tell you the font and the number of printings or the quality of the paper and so forth. But in Chinese horizontal landscape painting, let's say from the 1200s, 1300s, 1400s, very often at the end of the landscape, a scholar might do a commentary on the landscape, and that might have occurred 150 years, 120 years later than the painting, and then they accumulate a number of commentaries, and they're called colophons. And so I thought, in the spirit of the Arboretum, in a way, being a scroll, not literally a scroll, but a scroll-like kind of film, that it needed a colophon. And so we're going to see, the second film I'm going to show is called Colophon for the Arboretum Cycle. And then we'll have a Q&A, and then maybe a surprise for us all. Okay.
Well, something I have in mind, just to ask both of you. I think for the most part, these are places that you know well. I mean, in these films, locations, and you wander, but your wanderings are within, well, San Francisco for the most part. We were seeing, and so on the one hand, you know them well, but one senses that there's constant discovery and presence of mind. Obviously, otherwise, we see the discoveries, I think, emerge in front of our eyes, which I think is it's an amazing thing. But I'd just like to hear some thoughts about how you managed to do that in the midst of city, swirl of so much frenzy and activity, and your day's life and what. Yeah, come on, Nick. This he's on the wagon. Anyway, whatever. But seriously though, yeah, I just would like to hear you. Both of you. It seems to me, for you, the camera is a vehicle, among other things, for concentration. But I just would like to hear, how you navigate the familiar, but how you're always open to something really new and of the moment.
Well, actually, a lot of the locations that I go to, I'm not familiar with. I tend to roam around in the car and go places I have never been, and up and down back roads I've never been to, and look around, and sometimes I'll see something that will intrigue me, and that's when I'll get out the camera and relate to that. So at least now, San Francisco is a very small town, and at a certain point you get to know it. You get to know it all. So I strike out into the more and more, further and further into the countryside now, and yes. So I just kind of stop where I am and kind of love that area with my camera, as it were.
Something you spoke about yesterday was patience in terms of being able to have a roll in your camera sometimes for months, and on the one hand resist an easy image, that may not, especially if it's multiple layerings that you're already doing, add to that, or just a single image composition. But I mean, so there's a process of duration in terms of just gradual recording and just responding and deciding, okay, this is something that I'm going to actually record and I'm going to sort of like take in. But the point is that you must have many, many impulses along the way that you don't respond to.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah.
And what do you say?
But I guess the question is about patience, your particular.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, really about that process. for
Oh,
you.
well, definitely. I mean, we have a vision of what one would like, and the world very rarely gives you what you want. In case you haven't noticed it, I've noticed it myself. The world does not serve up what your needs are that easily sometimes. So, sure, you need the patience to go find what you need and go with that.
Okay, but I imagine that that's something that you've learned over time as well.
Yes.
Well, okay. So, Mr. Dorsky, what about yourself? In terms of familiar and in terms of still, what we saw in these films was like so of the moment and in the sense of becoming as we're watching it. In other words, it didn't seem in the slightest, to me anyway, familiar. But again, this is the Arboretum, the location, or these Golden Gate Park locations?
Well, autumn was all around town, and the Colophon. Well, the three sections of Colophon. The first section was down on Market Street.
Okay.
Yeah. And the second section was the Arboretum, and then the third section was this pond that's in the Arboretum. Yeah.
Something that you've looked at.
No, I don't. It's hard to explain. The energy to make these films comes out of pain, in a way. I don't know if pain's quite the right word. Some sense of suffering, and the desire to heal that suffering. For me, there's almost an eros in uniting the camera and the cinema, the celluloid, with the light. It's an erotic kind of gratification, and that eros helps as a kind of a balm to the suffering, of being a person. And so I don't know if I can say more than that. So it's a way of helping myself, and therefore hopefully helping others, because one assumes that there's a universal aspect to all of us. And the more intimate you are, the more universal. And truly intimate, the more truly universal. And trusting that. And I don't know. I've been a filmmaker since I was 10, and I love making films.
Something I was thinking about in both of your work tonight is just how informed and more than informed, how much at one you are in how you see the world in relationship to painting. I mean, we can talk about it in musical terms also, but tonight I was just so aware of the amazing constant mobility between form and a knowledge always of what we're seeing. And to me it's amazing and magical, actually. I mean, this word I'm using these couple of days, but it is amazing to me that this tool, which is designed to record precision, and fidelity to nature and reality, realism. Both of you are able to work within those terms, but to do such amazing plays of formal kinds of drawing from that, and so that basically we're really seeing something which has, I think, the complexity of great abstract painting or any other kind of painting, but nonetheless we're looking at pictures, photographs. So I don't know, it's just something that I've always been somewhat struck by, but particularly tonight, maybe just seeing both of your work next to each other, but also it's so clear to me. And in your case, just to finish my sentence, I mean, you're also someone who has works with other forms of visual media, at least with stained glass, which itself is a total form of abstraction, whether it's trying to be representational or not. So anyway, so that's a roundabout way of just saying, wow, what about, how deeply you're involved, both of you, with loving painting and watching, and how it informs the way you see the world. Yeah.
Well, yes. you have that square, which is just wonderful. The square, what can I say? The world is very funny. If you when we see, horizon to horizon. We see in a certain way, but I notice that as soon as we have if I walk between two, let's say, large buildings and they form some kind of side to my view, I'm much more excited about the sight that I see down at the end because there's some kind of a borderline there. And I don't know what the meaning of that is, but there's some kind of excitement for me in the use of the square. And as I mentioned yesterday, a filmmaker has to be not only a painter, not only painting comes in, but then sculpture comes in. For me, sculpture, I feel like sometimes I'm creating some kind of spatial dynamic with an object, so that object has the sort of properties of a sculpture, whatever, something that's alive about it because there's a dynamic of that frame around it. And I'd say a filmmaker has to be a part-time musician, dancer, painter, sculptor, poet, everything. You have to be a one-man band, so to speak, with the camera.
And the film.
Oh yeah, a filmmaker.
No, the material itself in your case.
Yeah.
And yourself?
Well, no, I love painting, and I do look at a lot of paint. I love looking at paintings. It interests me much more than photography, because this may be simplistic, but it seems to me that a good painting has time in it. It took time to paint it, but also it takes time to discover all the relationships in it. So, a good painting, is 15 or 20 minutes long, and where a lot of times for me a photograph is just a moment, I'm not against photography, but I'm just saying I identify more with painters than photographers.
And your images open up in time so eloquently. It's amazing.
Yeah, well, that's the other thing is that it's a time-based medium. So there lies the real power. How long you hold something, the tensions you can build up spatially between shots, so forth.
One thing that I seeing Jerome's films last night and then both of your films tonight, that I marvel at is the way that you can have, how do I say, complex passages or, shots, and then cut to relatively simple or at least straightforward image. And it's both a pause, but it's a kind of a clarifying clarification, in seeing, but it's actually almost, I always feel it on a deeper level, because I feel like I'm seeing in a way more clearly. So when I say clarification, it's like you go from these rich, sometimes many superimpositions, or as in your case, lots of things going on between, in your case, incredibly complex images, and then suddenly, bam, there's like a moment of simplicity, which is very eloquent.
Well, the cinema has these two aspects. It has shots and it has cuts. And they can be used for great wisdom. There's great wisdom in those two simple things. And the cut, in a sense, refreshes the view. A mediocre film has no refreshment of view in the cutting. It's a continuation of either a belief state or a mediocre state. But the great filmmaking of any form, narrative, whatever, the cut refreshes the shots, and there's a real relationship between One sparks the other. One ignites the other.
You want more?
Always.
Well, yes, I mean, basically, we do, as you say, refresh. I mean, basically, it's a matter of aliveness and using montage and so forth to you're doing something, and then that something suddenly requires you to sort of snap out of it, so to speak, and see some kind of simple sight or what have you, and that you sort of understand there's a kind of a relationship, perhaps, between formlessness and form.
One thing I would like to just ask about is color. You said you're a colorist, and certainly that's the case, and so are you. and you both are working within the limits, of course, of the material you have, the film stocks you have. And you talked about, one of your films yesterday being a paean, an homage to a stock that was being phased out, Ektachrome. And I remember over the years you dealing with negative and what have you. And I'm just wondering your current thoughts about those limitations, and I'll say how you seem to I don't know, overcome is the word, but you certainly work within the limitations, regardless of the losses and what you were saying. There's 3 colors and what have you. Just what are your thoughts about the fact that we are limited, you're limited to those stocks that Kodak decides, or the couple of other manufacturers that you have access to put out on the market, and the colors and where it's at today for you.
Well, this may not be the best way to answer it, but in art, the technology has always determined the aesthetics. Aesthetics have always been determined by technology. So, for instance, the Impressionists could become the Impressionists because of the introduction of tubed paint. So you could paint in plein air. You could paint outdoors because you had tubes. Same thing with the Bolex. Same thing with the stocks that Eastman Kodak is offering. These are the limitations, and you find a way to ignite some beauty within those limitations. I don't know, Kodak says they're going to come out supposedly before the new year with the new Ektachrome stock. I think if Jerry would love that. And I at first was horrified by having to shoot color negative because it seemed so lifeless. But I eventually found its life. I found where its sweet spots were, so to speak. What colors could be too bright and look great, which colors looked horrible if they got too bright. Which ones held in the dark. You just slowly learn it by just working, and you slowly start to make it better. Find a way to make it better. Because the negative stock now is designed for finishing digitally, and not really for finishing on film. So,
which means finishing on film puts it into a less than desirable form.
Well, you just have to find a way to make it. Well, the films look fine tonight.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, but something you had to work towards, basically, to understand how to be able to achieve.
It's kind of automatic. It's sort of like, it's very simple, like the way you would find an apple tree that had better apples than another apple tree, or, it's all very, you get, like the Eastman negative, it can't really distinguish between pinks and reds and oranges. It's very confused. And so you have to be very careful. Then you understand, it does this really well. Or a certain stock makes a blue sky corny. The blue isn't interesting. The blue and then all of a sudden you find a way to deal with that to make it more interesting. it's all very simple. I mean, it's just reaction, trying things and reacting.
And Jerry, what about the stocks you're working with, and just that whole.
Well, since they phased out Ektachrome, which is something I've worked with my whole life, you notice there was a lot of black and white up there, and there was a lot of black and white last night. And that's one of the things I've done, which is just turn from color altogether and shoot in black and white. And but facades, that's my first encounter with the color negative, which is a sort of the reduced color thing. So I'm still learning. I'm still at the learning stage, trying to make head or tail of it myself.
The last film, which was original, was what stock was that?
Well, there were touches of Ektachrome still in Marginalia last night,
Yeah.
and also in Bagatelle 1, the color material that was old Ektachrome. So that you could see that was a pretty lively palette there compared to the first film. Say.
But getting back to what you were saying, Nick, I imagine that every change, let's say every loss, like when you go from Kodachrome, and then you go down to Ektachrome and reversal, and you go from reversal. I mean, it's as you say, it's you obviously are able to, have been able so far to recover, and find what can be made actually beautiful and expressive with whatever you have at hand so far.
Yeah, well, one wants to make films, and so if you're going to start to mope, or even make an installation about moping about film or whatever, it's better to just find a way to go forward.
We're going to see another film, I think, at the end of this, so we don't want it to go interminably. So, questions, thoughts, comments?
I just want to push into that word abstraction for a moment and ask you guys if you view these films or intend the films as graphical in some way, political in some way, storytelling in some way that is not purely abstract.
I suppose so. To me, I mean, there has to be. Narrative exists if you have time. In a way, you have a narrative. You go forward with something, some kind of a story. Otherwise, it seems like you're avoiding a story of some kind. Something has to succeed from something else, and but at the same time, for myself, I hope to make a film that would reside in your head freely enough so that there's no particular reading that I have that you should be getting. I mean, I have my own kind of narrative that helps me make a film, but it's not necessarily a narrative that I'm not sending out codes, say, or you have to figure out my code to see what I'm really talking about. It's your film, really. It's completely your film. That's my feeling about that. So, but I am definitely someone who comes from, let's say, I began making films in the mid 20th century, which was the kind of the end of the major abstract period in art and so forth. But I still believe in it. I still find it a kind of a universal thing, and that's why I make these kind of films. Damn, I wanted to say something else, but I couldn't. I can't. I forgot it now. So that will have to be.
Okay, well, we'll come back. So, Nick, what about
Well, I think Jerome and I are both what you call narrative filmmakers. within the context of abstraction. No, and that no, very seriously, that the narrative aspect is a structural thing, and structure is not just the idea. It's not diagonals as opposed to circles. It could have to do with depression as opposed to ecstasy. It's, in other words, that the shots represent, not represent, that's too distant. The shots are evocations of the psyche, and the way the psyche develops and tries things and has hope and so forth. You know, like if you listen to a Mozart piano sonata, you know, it has completely to do with conversation. Someone is saying something, then someone says something against that, then someone says something more hopeful, then someone is hurt and runs away. I mean, in other words, Mozart piano music is a totally narrative event in an but as abstract form. So in that sense, the films are, you know, trying to evoke the human psyche. What can I say? You know, in narrative. Now, within experimental film, there are people who are anti-narrative, structuralist, or they try to take a narrative apart or deconstruct the narrative or show you that for the boys and girls and things. From my own sense, I feel that a film is, for my own pleasure, film is a narrative form. And I like, whether it's an abstract narrative form or or a Western, whatever, good narrative form is structurally intelligent and structurally revealing, having to do with clarity of energy and so forth.
Both Nathaniel and Jerome have serious backgrounds, that is to say, substantial backgrounds in having made more, let's say, story and informationally driven narrative films. And they themselves, I mean, each of them is like, totally, how do I say, involved, absorbed in the world of cinema mostly, which is narrative. And so they've seen everything over a course of a lifetime. And mostly dramatic narrative, but seen a lot. So interestingly, because their own work is what we saw tonight. Other, microphone.
Beautiful films. I worked for about 10 years really seriously with all types of film formats. And one was 9:5, and there was only a lab at the time in Paris that would process it. And I'm just curious, at the end there, and it's been a while for me since I've worked with film, but at the end there, we just started processing our own film just because we couldn't get the lab. It was the same thing you were saying about finding what was working with the film. It seemed easier if we did it as opposed to going to the lab. Do you process your own film? And if so, what's that like?
Let me answer for Jerry, so it's not so boring. No, what I mean, not that Jerry's boring, but that if I'll be Jerry, you know, and just to make it more interesting. So Jerry obviously did a lot of not hand processing, but hand painting on the surface of his films, and you can see that tonight. It was gorgeous. But we basically use labs. I mean, in the 60s, we did some hand processing, homemade processing, and explored that a little bit. But I think, basically, we like a nicely processed film by a nice lab, and luckily there's a few left. You can take over.
No. The answer is no.
Okay. Yep.
was wondering if you guys could talk about, although your films are silent, if the environment that you're shooting in sonically affects the rhythms of your shooting, or if that comes into how you shoot, and also, yeah, how you edit. Or obviously it seems like a lot of your editing's in camera, but if the audio environment of where you are affects your filming at all.
Well, I'll just take a quick pass at that. Certainly, of course. I mean, one is sensitive to what one hears all the time. I mean, and especially if you're working and you're trying to concentrate, what you're listening to is going to affect you. If you're in a very, very quiet place, that's going to add, I mean, that's going to make your ability to concentrate on your work very easy. Other times, sometimes you can be by a very exciting sound, and you might even want to take movies because of that, and something doesn't come across because of that, because there's a lot of, you could be at a parade or something like that, and there could be a lot of noise and music and cacophony and so forth, and you might see some kind of image, and you take it home and you go, well, it's not much of a shot. I was fooled by the amount of noise and or the interesting sound I was, but sometimes it can help you go along with something, and then other times it can be distracting, and that's about all I could say about that.
A couple more, I think.
Thank you both for such beauty tonight. My question was to Jerry. For Bagatelle 1, it seemed unusually vibrant as a film, and especially bold. It almost felt like a manifesto of film itself. I've never seen, with the grass blowing in the wind, there must have been very short exposures on each because it was so sharp. And then you intercut into the scratches of the film, and sometimes I couldn't tell the difference between. And I've never seen illustrated what film is as a medium. The texture and the 24 frames per second, and seeing it so beautiful, or 18 frames per second, so vibrantly illustrated. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Only in that. It's probably a one-of-a-kind experience, because at a certain point soon I would have to get a print of that film. And the print, for those of you who don't know what we've been talking about when we're talking about color negative and reversal. Reversal is film that you get back from the lab, and it's a positive image. But it's also your original material. So you have to be careful with it. If it gets scratched or something like that, then that scratch is there. You're kind of a little wild and foolish if you put it through a projector on a show like this. But I did it as a sort of a treat to show exactly what you're talking about, the kind of raw, brilliant energy of film, what film has, and there's nothing like showing original reversal to get that across. Yeah. And I remembered what I was, something about abstraction and narrative and so forth and so on. But I feel like now, in my old age, I make a film like, last night's Marginalia or something like that. It goes along and you think, well, what the hell is this movie about? But I realized that this, I went to the movies when I was young, 6 or 7, a lot. And I had a revival theater. This was around 1950, and so they had a lot of late 40s movies, noir films, playing nice, beautiful. And I would sit through these things. I had no idea what was going on. I couldn't possibly follow, but I loved films. And I often wonder, what was I even thinking sitting there watching these films with, Mitchum and Robert Widmark, whatever. And so I realized that there was something that was just beguiling about being absorbed in the moment without even regard to having any comprehension of what it was. I was already enthralled as, my smallest iteration in the film. So I think that's coming back and coming out in my films now. It's a sort of producing a sort of a film for 6-year-olds or something.
Okay. Okay, we have, I think, one more hand, or we have a couple more hands. All right, it's a couple more hands. Berenice.
Thank you for sharing your memories of watching film noir at the age of 6. And I wanted to ask both of you about your influences in narrative cinema. And in terms of structure, I can think of Lubitsch and I can think of Hawke. But I also wanted to know, because you talked about colophon, if you were influenced by non-American cinema, such as Ozu and Mizoguchi, for example, the Japanese tradition. What were the movies that really nurtured you, the narrative films that nurtured you?
Why don't you do that? You both do that, man. That's a good question. That's right.
Well, Ozu is very important, of course. I mean, he's essential. Kind of the Buddha of cinema. But I like Leo McCarey. There's so many times I think I have a favorite filmmaker, and then I'm endlessly seeing a film by someone I've never seen before. And being, like Jean Epstein was not very available until recently, and that's been a real revelation. I could go on. I mean, I love Rossellini. I love black and white Antonioni. Yeah, we've seen all of Ford's films a lot. Like anyone.
Well, I would like to also say that we tend to emphasize the director, and actually, the director wasn't taking the footage; it was the DP, the director of photography, was doing that. And so, I'm influenced by someone like William Clothier or anyone of. When I see films now, I'm interested in who shot it. And so I love Ford films, and I have to say, it's embarrassing to say it, but it is true. He's maybe my major influence in my photography, but it's of course not him. It's the photographers he gets, and Joe August and people like that. So right now I focus on, if someone, it's a Milton Krasner, whatever, I'll get excited, or.
Can you identify him?
Huh?
Well, Milton Krasner.
Yes, well, Milton Krasner. I can't. Milton Krasner in the 40s could light a crowd and make you think you were looking at a 3-dimensional movie. The way he would just put highlights on absolutely everybody in that crowd. He wouldn't miss a one, and it really looked like a 3-dimensional picture.
And one of his films, or 2 of his films, titles?
Well, there's my weak point. Titles.
Okay.
But besides, it's always a period, because that's the way they shot in the 40s. When the late 40s came, everything got kind of pale. When the early 50s came, things got even paler, and then everything changed again in the mid-50s. And
So someone like John Alton is old hat for you guys. No, I'm just kidding.
so,
We have one more question, Paul.
Thank you again. I was very curious about how each of you might influence each other in terms of your films. Do you have a way of talking and sharing your work with each other? Do you ever find yourselves heading out the door with your cameras in hand at the same time? I'm just curious how you guys influence each other's work and how you share your work with each other.
Or don't.
Or don't.
want me to say? Okay. You know, we're two guys with bull axes who live in a small town.
And they see each other a lot.
There's only room for one of us.
Now, you might wonder why I get in my car and roam around the countryside. Well, he stays home and hangs around the pond. Well, there's a reason for that. No, Nathaniel and I have shared interest and inspiration since we've met in 1964, and that's been going on to this day. And I see everything of his; he sees everything of mine. I try not to see too much. I mean, we see it all, but you know, in other words, I'm trying to be myself because I know we have the funny thing about when you meet somebody. And when I met him, you know, we were startled at how many things we had in common. And that is a joy, of course, but it's also, you know, when you're both artists, that's also, I mean, look at Van Gogh and Gauguin or something like that, trying to, you know, live in the same small town and be artists. So, I think we do pretty well being ourselves and sharing the same world.
We're not easy on each other. No, seriously, when we were young in our 20s, it wasn't, you know, of course it was let's just get stoned and look at film, but we were very strict, you know. We questioned each other, and there were a lot of barbs in a way, you know. It was a kind of a rigorous education between the two of us.
But you were each able to hone in on things for yourselves. It's amazing.
Well, yes, but of course you're born into different bodies. That's for sure, no matter what, you know. If you ever try to imitate somebody, you know how unsuccessful that would be. I have my nervous system. Nathaniel has his. I mean, we just basically can depend on the fact that we just sink into our own bodies and system when we do our work, and we know right then and there that it's going to be different. Because of that, we're two different people, and you could put we could put us together in this room to make a film, and we would surely have a lot of things similar and a lot of things that you would say, oh, I know who's who.
Maybe we'll move on to see something more. Yeah.
Are you up to that? It's only 13 minutes. 13 minutes. I'll explain the situation of this film. Why? Normally I wouldn't be showing it, but this is a sort of extreme situation. 7.5 weeks ago, I had open heart surgery had a valve replaced, and there was a month before that happened where I knew it was coming, the operation, and I was getting very anxious. And I've found out since that it's an operation that causes great anxiety to everyone who's going to have it.
Big surprise, huh?
Yeah. because they saw you in half and then take out your heart and then put you on a machine and all that. So I decided that I had something like 3 weeks to go before the operation, that I got 21 rolls of film, and I said, I'm going to shoot a roll of film every day until I go to the hospital. You know, it's just something. I was freaking out. I might as well do something. You know, so I'd shoot those rolls of film. And the day before I left for the hospital, I UPS'd off the film off to the lab, so that when I was in the ICU, like a good Jewish boy, I was actually accomplishing something. You know. And so then I thought my mother would be very, it was a very good use of my energy and time. So then a few weeks after coming home, I began to think strong enough, because you couldn't do this kind of motion or anything. I had the footage, and I looked at it and then began to edit it rather quickly. And so this film is shot. I think the overall feeling for me personally is that it's elegiac. It's like saying goodbye to the world, also a little terrified and all that. And
The title again?
the title is called Calyx, C-A-L-Y-X. A calyx is the husk that goes around a flower before it blooms. Those kind of more sturdy kind of leaves around it. And it came because during the weeks preceding the operation, I fell in love with this piece by Stravinsky called Persephone, where the text was written by André Gide. And Persephone goes to the underworld and returns. So it was kind of a feeling like the operation. You're going to go into the underworld and then hopefully come back to the surface of the earth. And in that text, at one point, it's mentioned that it says the calyx of the Narcissus. The Narcissus is very important. It's, I think, how Pluto seduced Persephone. But so the calyx, the word came up, and I just said, oh, that's the title. And then I realized it meant husk, and so it's a title. Like, what can I say?
One final thing, I want to urge you guys to come back tomorrow night. I've seen the Arboretum cycle 3 times, and it's unlike anything else, including his work. Bye-bye. Enjoy this new surprise.